When my family and I first bought our property, it felt like a dream come true. Rolling hills, quiet streets, and a little plot of land that promised privacy and freedom. We were finally free from the cramped condos and noisy neighbors of the city. I could see my kids running across the lawn, barbecues on the weekends, and maybe even a small garden or two. The HOA seemed polite enough when we signed the papers, friendly, organized, just a few rules that didn't feel overbearing. At the time, I thought, great, they'll keep things neat without getting in the way. Little did I know, I was about to learn that some HOAs take that control thing a bit too far. It started small. One morning, I noticed a few survey stakes planted along the edge of my property. I assumed maybe the neighbors were doing some landscaping or some utility company needed access. I didn't pay much attention at first. After all, stakes in the ground weren't a big deal, right? But then, over the next few days, more stakes appeared, perfectly aligned and with small flags fluttering in the wind. I remember standing on my porch, coffee in hand, trying to make sense of it. What are they measuring? My yard is that big. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was some harmless neighborhood planning or maybe a miscommunication. Then came the heavy machinery. I was outside one morning when I saw a bulldozer slowly making its way across the corner of my property. My stomach sank. Wait, that's my land, I muttered, my heart starting to race. I walked closer, trying to see if anyone was around, and that's when I spotted the small construction crew, helmets, orange vests, the whole setup. They were marking plots, moving earth, and beginning what looked suspiciously like foundation work. I didn't say anything immediately. I just stood there, frozen, feeling a mix of disbelief and rising panic. It couldn't be real. No one would just start building on someone else's land, right? I mean, surely this was some misunderstanding. I went inside and grabbed the HOA contact list. My hand shook slightly as I dialed the number for the president, a woman who had always smiled politely at community meetings. The phone rang 3 times. 4. Finally, she picked up, cheerful as ever. "Oh yes," she said. "Hi, I'm a new homeowner on Elm Street, and I think you might have crews on my land." There was a pause, a faint shuffling of papers. "Oh yes, we're just starting the community improvement projects," she said, all smiles. "Nothing to worry about, it's all part of the plan." I blinked. "Community improvement projects?" I asked, "on my land?" "Well, yes, it's just we thought this section would benefit from commercial development. Small shops, some offices, your neighbors will love it," she replied, as if suggesting I plant tulips in my front yard. I laughed nervously, thinking she must be joking. "You want to build commercial buildings on my property?" "Oh, don't worry about the details, just a minor oversight on paperwork. We'll sort it out later," she said before hanging up. I sank onto my porch, feeling a strange mixture of disbelief and anger. Commercial buildings on my land, and she was just breezy about it. My mind raced. Could I stop them? Should I stop them immediately? Or should I watch and gather evidence? As I sipped my now lukewarm coffee, I realized something important. If I reacted too quickly, I might miss the bigger picture. There was a story here, a plan unfolding, and I had a front row seat. I decided to wait to document everything and see how far they would go. By the time the sun began to set, the stakes in my yard looked less like harmless markers and more like ominous sentinels. Machines were humming in the distance, and the first foundations were being poured. The stage was being set, and I had no idea how intense the next chapter would be. All I knew was this: I wasn't about to lose my property without a fight. The next morning, I woke up early, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Maybe the stakes and the heavy machinery were just a practice drill or some weird HOA exercise in community planning. I stepped outside and my hopes were immediately crushed. There they were, dozens of workers moving with purpose, surveying my land like it was already theirs. Bulldozers, cement mixers, and trucks were everywhere, carving up my once pristine yard. It looked like a mini-city was about to rise where my grass and flower beds had been. And that's when the anger hit me, the kind of anger that makes your hands shake and your brain go into overdrive at the same time. I marched straight to the site, trying to look calm, though my heart was pounding. "Hello," I said to one of the foremen. He looked at me as if I were a mild inconvenience, not the homeowner standing on her own property. "Yes," he asked, clipboard in hand. "You're on my land," I said firmly. "Stop work immediately." He blinked. "Ma'am, the HOA approved this project. Everything's legal." I laughed, though it came out more like a strangled bark. "The HOA approved this project on my land. You realize I own this land, right?" He tilted his head, clearly thinking I was exaggerating. "Oh, I'm sure that will be sorted out. Don't worry, we're just following orders." Orders from the HOA, of course. That explained the polite smiles and their confidence. They thought I was some overreacting homeowner who would call, complain, and then quietly retreat. they hadn't met me yet. I stormed back to my car and dialed the HOA president's number again. My voice was this time, "We need to talk now on my property." There was a pause long enough to make my stomach churn. "Of course," she said finally in that same syrupy tone, "I'll be right there." I hung up trying to steady my shaking hands. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately with the evidence of ownership, the deed, the tax papers, the survey maps, but another part of me realized I needed to think strategically. If I acted too quickly, I might tip my hand and let them scramble to cover their tracks. I needed patience, and patience, I reminded myself, can be a weapon. When she arrived, she stepped out of her SUV with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had a clipboard, a folder, and an air of someone who believed she was untouchable. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I understand there's some confusion." "Confusion," I repeated. "You're building 12 commercial buildings on land that I own. How is that confusion?" She laughed nervously, waving a hand. "Minor paperwork issue, nothing to worry about, we'll get it sorted." I crossed my arms. "Minor paperwork issue? You've been digging up my lawn, pouring foundations, and moving equipment onto my property for days. Do you have any idea what this is doing to me?" Her smile faltered. "Well, perhaps we can." "No," I interrupted. "You're not perhaps seeing anything. This stops today. I need a full explanation, and I need it in writing. I'm not leaving until this is clear." The tension was thick. Workers paused, unsure of whether to continue. The HOA president scribbled furiously in her folder, muttering something about permits and approvals. But the truth was simple: no permit could override the deed to my land. I stood there, letting the moment stretch, knowing that my calm assertiveness was more powerful than her panic. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I just stared at her and the half-finished buildings around me, silently calculating the steps I would take next. And then she said it, the line that made my blood boil and my plan crystallize. Maybe we can make it work somehow." That was it. That one careless phrase revealed everything. They thought I could be persuaded, coerced, or distracted. They had no idea that I wasn't just fighting to stop this project. I was going to let it finish, document every step, and then show them something they couldn't argue with: the deed. I walked back to my porch after she left, taking a deep breath. My lawn was no longer just a yard, it was the of patience, strategy, and observation. And I was ready to watch every nail hammered, every wall built, and every mistake they made along the way. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the partially built structures, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't going to be over soon. And if I played it right, the HOA wouldn't just regret building on my land, they'd regret underestimating me. I decided to let the construction continue. On paper, it might have seemed counterintuitive: why let someone build on your land? But I knew patience could be more powerful than confrontation. The HOA thought they were in control, they thought I'd panic or cave, and they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Every morning, I watched from my porch as the machines rumbled to life. Bulldozers carved the corners of my property, cement trucks poured foundations, and cranes lifted steel beams that glinted in the sunlight. The workers moved with precision, oblivious to the fact that each brick they laid was on the wrong land. I had a front row seat to their overconfidence, and I intended to savor every moment. I documented everything: photos, videos, detailed notes of dates and times, conversations with workers, and even the occasional misplaced blueprint they left behind. Every mistake, every oversight, every shred of evidence that would make the HOA's actions undeniable, I collected it. I had never felt so meticulous in my life, but the satisfaction I got from knowing that each image would later prove my case made it worth it. Neighbors began to notice, of course. Some came over, peeking through the fence, whispering about the strange activity on my property. I smiled politely, saying it was a community enhancement project, and let them watch the chaos unfold. Most didn't know who owned the land or why this was happening, which only added to the suspense of the situation. There were moments that tested my patience. One day, a worker accidentally damaged a small section of my flower bed near the back fence. I could have stormed over and demanded immediate restitution, but instead I took a deep breath, photographed the damage, and made a note. Every action I didn't take now would make the eventual reveal even more dramatic. Even the HOA president made occasional visits. Each time she arrived, her confident smile was her footsteps slightly hurried. She never suspected that I was fully aware of everything happening. She still spoke as if she held the power, still tried to charm and negotiate with me, not realizing I was already playing a different game, one of patience, observation, and strategy. The suspense of watching them work day after day was almost addictive. Each crane lift, each brick set, each foundation poured felt like a countdown to a revelation that would leave them speechless. I often joke to myself that it was like hosting a reality show on my own lawn. Welcome to HOA builds a mini city on someone else's land. Stay tuned for the dramatic twist. Even my family got involved in small ways. My kids would peek through the fence asking questions. Mom, are those shops going to open here? I smiled, telling them not quite, but we're learning a valuable lesson in patience. My spouse quietly supported the plan, helping me organize photos, tracking construction milestones, and occasionally warning me not to laugh too loudly at the absurdity of it all. The workers, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. They believed they were doing a perfectly legal job, moving efficiently and taking pride in what they assumed would be a community success. The contrast between their diligence and my quiet observation only added to the suspense. Every beam set in place, every wall raised, every window installed, it all became part of the story I was documenting for the ultimate reveal. As weeks passed, the 12 buildings slowly took shape. The air was filled with dust, the constant hum of machines, and the occasional clang of metal on metal. The transformation of my property was both exhilarating and infuriating. Each morning, I'd step onto my porch, coffee in hand, and watch the skyline of a miniature commercial district rising where my garden once was. And through it all, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't reacting with anger or panic. I was collecting evidence, letting their overconfidence grow, and preparing for the moment when patience would pay off. The suspense wasn't just in the construction, it was in knowing that the HOA's arrogance was setting them up for a fall. By the time the foundations were finished and the skeletal frames of the buildings were visible from the street, I knew the endgame was approaching. The scene looked like a small town rising overnight, but unlike any town I'd ever seen, it was all on the wrong property. I leaned back on my porch, letting the wind cool my face, and whispered to myself, "Keep going, let them finish. They're about to learn a lesson they'll never forget." Finally, the day came when the 12 commercial buildings were fully constructed. I stood on my porch, looking at what had once been my lawn, now a miniature business district that stretched across my property. It was almost surreal, 12 buildings, neat, polished, fully ready for tenants, and every brick, every beam, every window was on my land. I could have panicked, I could have confronted the workers and the HOA immediately, stopping everything mid-progress. But I didn't. I had let them finish for a reason. Every moment I had spent documenting, every photo, every note, every misplaced blueprint, all of it was about to pay off. The time for subtlety was over, it was time for the reveal. I drove to the HOA office, deed in hand, trying to keep my pulse steady. The receptionist glanced up, nodding the determined look on my face. "Can I help you?" she asked, cheerful as ever. "Yes," I said firmly. "The HOA president, please. I have something she needs to see." Within minutes she appeared, clipboard in hand, smiling with that practiced calm. "Hello, what brings you here?" she asked, as if the world was still under her control. I held up the deed. "You tell me, take a look at this." She blinked, her smile faltering as she glanced down, her eyes widened slightly. I don't, this must be a mistake," she stammered. "No mistake," I said calmly. "This is my property. The land your HOA has been building on for weeks belongs to me." Her face paled. I could almost see her brain working in overdrive, trying to rationalize, negotiate, or come up with some excuse. But the deed didn't lie. The surveys didn't lie. The foundations, walls, and windows, immovable, undeniable, didn't lie. I spread the documents across the desk, showing tax records, official plats, and historical maps. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The HOA had overstepped in a colossal way. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice wavering. We didn't realize." "Didn't realize what?" I asked, leaning slightly forward. "That you built 12 commercial buildings on land that you don't own? That you're standing in someone else's office with your plans and construction permits in hand, assuming you can just sort it out later? That didn't cross your mind?" She fumbled with her papers, muttering something about community benefits and future tenants. I let her ramble for a few seconds. It was almost comical. Then I interrupted. "Stop, just stop. The only thing that matters is that this is my property. Everything else is secondary." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling over everyone present. The receptionist peeked over the counter, wide-eyed, unsure whether to flee or eavesdrop. I noticed her subtly inch back, realizing the gravity of the situation. "What happens now?" the president finally asked, her tone a mix of fear and frustration. "What happens now?" I repeated, letting the words hang. "You start figuring out how to undo this mess, and trust me, you're going to need to move fast, because every day that passes, the evidence only grows, and so does my patience." I left the office shortly after, giving them one last look over my shoulder. The mixture of panic and disbelief on their faces was almost satisfying. I didn't celebrate, not yet. That would come later, when the HOA realized that patience and preparation were more powerful than panic and authority. When I returned to my property, the construction workers were still there, oblivious. They waved and nodded, assuming everything was proceeding as planned. I smiled faintly. They had no idea that every wall they had built, every brick they had laid, was now a critical piece of evidence. I walked along the perimeter of the property, taking a mental inventory of every building, every corner, every detail I had meticulously documented over the weeks. It all mattered now. The suspense of what was to come, the slow dismantling of the HOA's overconfidence, was electric. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange calm. The reveal had been delivered, the HOA knew the truth, the stage was set, and soon they would understand that building 12 commercial buildings on the wrong land wasn't just a mistake, it was a catastrophe for them. I leaned against the fence, staring at my property. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the structures, giving them an almost cinematic feel. 12 buildings looming silently, waiting for their owners to realize the error of their ways, and I was ready for the next act. The day after the reveal, the atmosphere around the HOA office changed. Gone were the confident smiles, replaced by furtive glances, hurried phone calls, and the unmistakable tension of people realizing they had seriously miscalculated. I watched it all from my porch, trying not to smile too widely. The dominoes were starting to fall, and I was holding the first piece. I knew this wasn't going to be solved with a polite conversation. 12 buildings weren't going to vanish overnight, and the HOA wasn't going to hand over control willingly. I called my lawyer that afternoon, explaining the full situation. She listened quietly, then said something that made my stomach relax. "You've got everything you need: deeds, surveys, photographs, dates, witness statements. Legally, this is airtight. The HOA has no leg to stand on." With legal representation on board, the next step was formal action. Notices were drafted, official communications sent, and meetings scheduled. I had been patient, strategic, and meticulous, and now it was time for the HOA to feel the consequences of their overconfidence. Their first attempt to negotiate caught me off guard, just a little. They tried the "we thought it was common land" angle, insisting that some minor paperwork would sort things out and that we could reach an agreement to avoid legal hassle. I listened, politely nodding, while every instinct in me screamed, "Don't bite now." I had waited too long, watched too closely, and documented too thoroughly to settle for half measures. The first meeting with their legal team was tense. They arrived, folders in hand, looking like they were ready for battle. I calmly laid out all the evidence: property maps, tax records, official surveys, photographs documenting construction, and even the timeline of communications. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer, punctuating the truth that the buildings were built on my land and that the HOA had no authority to do so. There were moments that made me want to laugh out of disbelief more than humor. One lawyer leaned forward, pointing at a map, and said, "Are you sure about these boundaries?" I raised my eyebrows, showing him the deed and the surveys. "Yes," I replied calmly, "and I suggest you take another look before wasting more of everyone's time." The tension in the room was palpable. The HOA president's face betrayed her panic, her carefully constructed confidence crumbling under the weight of incontrovertible evidence. Each question she tried to pose was countered by my lawyer, who had clearly reviewed every inch of the property and every document I had collected. I stayed calm throughout. I didn't need to yell, threaten, or belittle anyone. The suspense of the situation, the irony of watching them scramble while I remained composed, was enough. It was almost cinematic, the overconfident authority figures reduced to fumbling, the underdog holding all the cards, and the truth shining brighter than any argument they could make. By the end of the first formal hearing, it was clear: the HOA was in trouble. They had underestimated me, underestimated my patience, and underestimated the power of proper documentation. The lawyers advised them to take immediate steps to halt any further activity and begin the process of rectifying the situation. Even then, the suspense didn't vanish. I knew the HOA could try to appeal, stall, or manipulate the process in small ways. Every day that passed was another opportunity for them to complicate things. But I also knew that with patience and persistence, every layer of their overreach could be undone, and eventually the 12 buildings they had built would be fully recognized as intrusions on my property. I left the courthouse that day with a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the legal system could see the truth, and anticipation for the next phase: reclaiming my land entirely and ensuring the HOA learned a lesson in humility. On the drive back home, I couldn't help but glance at my property, now silent except for the occasional maintenance crew checking on the buildings. They were finished, but they were also a monument to hubris, the perfect setup for what was coming next. The suspense wasn't just in the legal proceedings, it was in knowing that the next move, the one that would finally restore full control to me, had to be precise, strategic, and undeniable. Patience had brought me this far, but now it was time to take the final steps toward victory. And I knew the HOA was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about paperwork or property lines. It was about the consequences of underestimating someone who had waited, watched, and planned every move. After the legal battle began, the HOA quickly realized they were in over their heads. What had started as casual overconfidence now looked like a disaster unraveling in slow motion. From my vantage point, I couldn't help but watch the chaos unfold, part of me amused, part of me incredulous. The first sign of real panic came when their staff started running in circles, trying to figure out how to undo weeks of construction. They had built 12 commercial buildings on land that wasn't theirs, and now they had to deal with the fallout. Orders were given, memos were written, and frantic phone calls were made, but the pieces weren't fitting together. I documented everything, of course. Photos of hastily posted stop work signs, emails scrambling to justify the error, and even workers being sent to measure plots again only to discover the obvious: they had built on the wrong property. I had all the proof I needed, but watching them flounder in real time was almost as satisfying. The humor of the situation was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I watched a construction crew move a stack of cement blocks only to have a manager wave them off, shouting something about wrong side of the property line. They lifted, carried, and placed the blocks back where they had started. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing. 12 buildings, built meticulously, now surrounded by confusion and chaos because someone forgot to check the deed. The HOA president showed up more often now, her confidence completely replaced by nervous energy. Each time she approached me, her voice wavered. "We're working on it," she'd say, trying to sound authoritative while her eyes darted to the buildings she had proudly overseen. I just nodded, letting her stew in the silence between her words. She was learning the hard way that the deed is stronger than any HOA rule. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice the strange turn of events. Some were confused, some curious, and a few whispered about the drama with the new homeowner. I smiled politely whenever they asked questions, giving vague answers while internally enjoying the unfolding spectacle. They had no idea that what looked like chaos was actually a perfectly orchestrated moment of triumph waiting to happen. Every phone call from their side added suspense. They tried subtle threats, hints of penalties, and vague promises of negotiations, but I stayed calm. My lawyer advised me not to respond to provocations, and I followed that advice to the letter. Let them panic, I thought, let them squirm. Each mistake they made now would only strengthen my position. Some days I took walks around the perimeter of my property, surveying the 12 buildings with a sense of quiet amusement. Each structure, rising from the ground with so much effort and pride, now symbolized their arrogance. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had poured months of work into something they would never legally own. It wasn't all laughter, though. The tension was real. There was always a risk that the HOA might find a loophole, that a misfiled document could weaken my position, or that an overzealous worker might cause damage that would complicate matters. I double-checked every photograph, every recorded conversation, every official map. Suspense lingered because I knew I had to be meticulous. One small oversight could derail weeks of careful planning. Even as they struggled, I continued to document everything. Emails, calls, construction mistakes, and frantic meetings, all of it was recorded, timestamped, and filed. Each small victory, each frustrated glance from the HOA president was another step toward reclaiming full control. By the end of the month, it was clear the HOA was trying, but ineffectively. The buildings remained, the work had been done, and every move they made to fix the situation only highlighted their mistake. I could see it in the way their team members exchanged frustrated glances, the way construction crews hesitated before moving equipment, and the way the president avoided my gaze whenever she passed by. From my porch, I sipped my coffee, watching the sun set behind the dozen commercial structures. I knew the final chapter was approaching. Soon, the legal process, combined with their own mistakes, would force them to admit what everyone already knew: the buildings were mine, and the HOA's overreach had gone too far. Patience, strategy, and careful observation had brought me this far. The suspense wasn't just in the legal battle, it was in watching them unravel while knowing the endgame was already in motion. The next steps would secure victory, and when they finally realized the truth, it would be unforgettable. The HOA's panic had reached full throttle. After weeks of watching them scramble, fumble, and flounder, it was finally time to take decisive action. Patience and observation had brought me to this point, but now I needed to turn the tables completely. The 12 commercial buildings loomed across my property like silent monuments to their hubris, and I was about to reclaim control brick by brick. The first step was making the legal instructions clear and final. My lawyer sent formal notices demanding immediate cessation of all HOA activities on my property and outlining the steps required to remove any unauthorized claims. The notices were precise, leaving no wiggle room. I had anticipated every possible loophole, and the HOA couldn't argue against solid documentation. The first few days were almost cinematic. Construction crews returned, hesitant, confused, and cautious. Each crew leader approached me nervously, asking questions that previously would have never crossed their minds. "Is it okay if we move equipment?" one worker asked. I raised an eyebrow, enjoying the irony. "Only if it stays on your own land," I said. He nodded quickly, retreating without another word. Meanwhile, the HOA staff was in full-blown crisis mode. Their attempts to negotiate or manipulate the situation fell flat against the mountain of evidence I had amassed. Emails went unanswered, phone calls were returned with stammers and excuses, and every attempt to undermine my claims simply reinforced how meticulous and prepared I had been. Watching them struggle, I realized how powerfully suspenseful this whole ordeal had become. Every moment felt like a chess game, and I was several moves ahead. Next came the dismantling of their overreach. With legal oversight, the HOA began undoing the changes they had imposed on my property. Signage was removed, utility modifications reversed, and temporary structures cleared. I supervised every step not out of mistrust, but to ensure nothing was left to chance. It was satisfying to see them finally grasp the consequences of their overconfidence. Their so-called improvements were being unraveled piece by piece. There were moments that made me smile quietly, despite the seriousness of the situation. One crew accidentally carried supplies into the wrong section of my land, only to be redirected back by a frazzled HOA manager. I shook my head, thinking how poetic it was. Every small blunder they made was a reminder that I had played the long game while they had rushed in blind. Neighbors began to notice the shift too. Some came over cautiously, unsure what had happened, whispering about the reversal of the mini-commercial district. I greeted them warmly, offering casual explanations while secretly reveling in the satisfaction of seeing the HOA's miscalculations exposed in plain view. Even the HOA president showed up, visibly shaken. Her confident, polished demeanor had crumbled, replaced by hurried movements and whispered instructions. She attempted to negotiate one last time, offering vague promises and half-hearted apologies, but the deeds, surveys, and legal documents left no room for discussion. This wasn't about diplomacy anymore, it was about ownership, facts, and undeniable truth. Step by step, control shifted back into my hands. By the end of the second week, all unauthorized actions by the HOA had been reversed. The 12 commercial buildings stood as silent reminders of the chaos they had caused, still on my property, yet entirely under my authority. I could finally walk the perimeter without anxiety, knowing that the battle was nearly over. The suspense of the situation lingered, though. Each day brought the possibility of another maneuver, another attempt to complicate the process. But I had anticipated every scenario, and patience remained my greatest weapon. The HOA had learned through frustration and embarrassment that control is not a matter of titles or meetings. It is a matter of preparation, observation, and strategy. Finally, one quiet afternoon, I stood in the center of my property, surveying the 12 buildings and the carefully restored boundaries. The construction crews had left, the HOA had conceded, and the neighborhood had witnessed the slow unraveling of a massive miscalculation. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief. The suspense was over, but the memory of watching it all unfold would linger. I couldn't resist a small laugh as I imagined future conversations among the HOA members. They would replay every error, every failed attempt to assert authority, every moment when their confidence collided with reality. And through it all, I had remained calm, strategic, and undeniably in control. Patience had won, observation had won, and in the end, justice had been restored not through anger or confrontation, but through meticulous planning, documentation, and the quiet satisfaction of letting the consequences unfold naturally. The HOA had learned a lesson I doubt they would ever forget. Never underestimate someone who knows their rights, understands their property, and is willing to wait for the perfect moment to act. And I had 12 buildings, a restored property, and a story that would be told for years. Proof that sometimes the best victories are those achieved with patience, strategy, and a little suspense. The dust had settled, the machines were gone, the construction crews had packed up, and the HOA had conceded finally, completely, and without argument. My property, once disrupted by 12 commercial buildings, was now fully under my control. The surreal sight of those buildings standing tall but legally mine felt like a monument not just to patience but to strategy, persistence, and knowing your rights. I walked across the property one last time, surveying every corner. Each building told a story: the audacity of the HOA, the overconfidence of people who assumed they could override ownership, and the silent, methodical planning that had allowed me to reclaim everything. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. 12 buildings, months of work, and yet they had built nothing on legal ground. Their empire had been a mirage, beautiful, substantial, and entirely imaginary when it came to ownership. Neighbors began stopping by more frequently, some curious, some eager to congratulate me. I explained it to them simply without dramatics. They built on the wrong land. I documented everything. The HOA had to back down. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to amusement. One neighbor leaned over the fence and whispered, "You should charge admission. It's like watching a reality show unfold." I laughed, thinking how true that was. The HOA president, she mostly avoided the neighborhood for weeks. When I did see her, the confident air was gone, replaced by quiet resignation. I didn't gloat, there was no need. The victory wasn't about humiliation, it was about justice, and the buildings themselves stood as evidence that I had won. Every time she glanced at them, she was reminded that authority without awareness, without patience, and without respect for property rights is nothing. I took time to reflect on the lessons this experience had taught me. First and foremost, patience is power. Letting them finish their construction had been the hardest part. Every day I watched machines carve into my land, every day I documented mistakes, every day I resisted the urge to act impulsively, built suspense, but it also built evidence. The final reveal and legal success wouldn't have been possible without that careful observation. Second, preparation matters. I had my deed, surveys, records, photos, and legal counsel ready. When the moment came, I was not reactive, I was deliberate. The HOA's attempts to negotiate, intimidate, or confuse me failed because I had anticipated every angle. It was a reminder that meticulous planning is often more powerful than confrontation. Third, humor can be a shield. There were moments when frustration could have overtaken me, when watching construction workers lay foundations on my property could have felt infuriating. Instead, I found amusement in their mistakes and irony in their confidence. Humor kept me calm, focused, and sane throughout the ordeal. And finally, justice often comes quietly, not with dramatic explosions or shouting matches, but with patience, proof, and persistence. Watching the HOA scramble, make mistakes, and eventually concede was satisfying, but it was the quiet victory of knowing that I had done everything by the book that made it complete. The 12 buildings remained, not as a monument to their hubris, but as a symbol of the story I could tell for years. When friends and family visited, I would show them around, sharing the tale of patience, planning, and strategic observation that had allowed me to reclaim my land. Their laughter, disbelief, and admiration reminded me that sometimes the best victories are those others don't see coming. As the sun set over my property, casting long shadows across the buildings, I felt a profound sense of closure. The HOA had learned their lesson, my rights had been protected, and I had navigated one of the most absurd, stressful, and ultimately satisfying experiences of my life. I smiled to myself, thinking about the irony one last time. They had built 12 commercial buildings, confident in their authority, only to be reminded of a simple truth. Ownership isn't a matter of power, influence, or rules, it's a matter of law, proof, and patience. I took a deep breath, walking through the now quiet property, the suspense of the past months finally giving way to relief. I had won not through anger, not through confrontation, but through careful planning, strategic patience, and quiet observation. And as I watched the last rays of sunlight bounce off the buildings, I knew this story would be remembered not for the chaos, but for the lesson it left behind. Never underestimate someone who knows their rights, has patience, and isn't afraid to let others finish their mistakes. Victory was mine, and it had been than I could have imagined. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.